So reason 5 is the first cell. The first cell. And this is kind of like if you ever study or ever hear about evolution, this is kind of like covered in about 3 sentences by most people, because it's like almost, it's assumed that life just happened, and they don't get into any of the details about how that life just happened. But we're going to talk about that because that's very important. And again, I want you to think of yourself as having opportunity of reaching people who say God doesn't exist, and really understanding this evidence, because this is powerful evidence. If you ever want to talk to somebody, someone says, I don't believe God exists, and they say, what proof do you have God exists? This is absolute proof that God exists for anybody who questions the existence of God. But you always have to bring someone to the point of the cause. Just like we talk about, well, where did the universe come from? We know the universe had a starting point. Where did it come from? Well, we don't know. But I know God didn't make it. Well, where did life come from? Well, we don't know. It just happened. But I know God didn't do it. Okay? This is kind of like the secular community we live in. The secular community, God is not an option in that option. So talking about today, the scientific evidence for the existence of God. So let's look at the first cell. The first cell. This is Grandpa. Great-great-great-great-grandpa, the first cell. So where did life come from? So what are our options? One option is it was created. Another option is it's an accident. And a third option that we hear about often is what's called alien seeding, okay? That it came from outer space. So this is actually a game you can buy, Primordial Soup, okay? But I like using this as a picture to kind of like point the picture, because what is a primordial soup? The idea is that in the beginning, there was a giant pond of liquid with different amino acids, different phosphates in it, and those amino acids, those phosphates somehow came together to form amino acids, and those amino acids assembled themselves into proteins, which then assembled themselves into cells, which then coded themselves into DNA, which had life, which then knew it had to replicate itself, and voila, we're here. So this is kind of like a real quick version of the source. If you go to any science classes, if you study biology, this is always talked about in like 2 or 3 sentences, and then all of a sudden we're at the first cell, and then we're at evolution. Okay, but that's where it's important. So let me show you a quick video that kind of illustrate what I'm saying. Okay, so I want everybody to see what the argument is. Like this is the argument that if you went into this is a TED Talk video. If you went into a university, if you were in high school, if you were even in middle school, and they say, well, where does life come from? That's what you would hear. That's kind of like the program story. But I want everybody to see how basically you just go from primordial soup to life, and that life replicates itself. And I want everybody to see how that argument breaks down once you understand what really happens in life, that it's impossible what they just described. But this is where a lot of kids that are raised in the Christian church, that are raised in the church, or they go to college, and once they go to college, they're basically indoctrinated that God doesn't exist, there's no evidence for God, and that you are an evolved being, that you're involved, and the belief in God is mythology. So what I want to show you is how you as a believer in Jesus Christ can literally tear apart the whole evolutionary argument with the scientific facts. So before I start, let me see if anybody has any questions. So the main underpinning of a lot of the atheistic arguments is a guy named Charles Darwin. So Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species, and we're going to talk about that book in a second. But in a letter that Darwin's son wrote to his friend Joseph Dalton Hooker in 1871, this is what we read, okay, about Darwin's pondering about, well, how did that first life come about? How did our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather come into existence? Okay, I'm being sarcastic. But so it says, on that same subject, my father wrote in 1871, it is often said that all conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present, which could ever be present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive of some little pond with all sorts of ammonia, phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes at the present day, such matter would instantly be devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. So Darwin understood the complexity and the problem of surmising that life just came into existence. Now, what Darwin wrote, and we'll talk more about this, is he looked at what's called micro changes. So Darwin was on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he observed on the Galapagos Islands, he observed the finches' beaks, how they changed and from their different islands and from their different environments. And he used that kind of as a basis for the idea that living things change and extrapolates to another level. So he said that his idea was the cause of life. How did life change, the variety of life? How did that happen, okay? The ability to change within species using the finches on the Galapagos Islands, okay? So what he did is he proved microevolution, also known as natural selection. We call it natural selection, okay? It's a variety within kinds. And this is very important to understand the language here. A variety within kinds, okay? Why is that important? Because you have to understand the difference between what's called microevolution and macroevolution. One is biblical, one is non-biblical, okay? And so microevolution is variety within kinds. Look here. I'm short. There's people who are tall, okay? I have hair. Some people don't have hair. Color of my skin is different than the color of other people's skins, okay? My nose is a big nose, okay? Some people have different noses. My wife has a little small nose, okay? So that's variation. That's variation within the humankind, just like there's variation within birds. But now, it's important to understand that. Now, one of the reasons that Darwin was familiar with this is because where Darwin was from, they did what was called selective breeding. That they knew that they could actually take animals and change the way animals looked and acted based on selecting traits in different animals, such as pigeons. You could take different characteristics that pigeons had, and you could breed just for those characteristics. So that was called selective breeding. We do that with dogs. But on the Galapagos Islands, there was no selective breeding, but the finches were a variety. So he called that natural selection, that there were variations within those finches that nature was selecting, such as the ability to eat hard shells or hard seeds, so the beaks had to be harder. So also there was selective breeding in where he was from with sheep. So he took that position that was a known thing, which was selective breeding, and he extrapolated that to nature, called natural selection, which is actually a very biblical concept. It's actually taught in the Bible, okay? But then he extrapolated it to what's called macroevolution. So, and the evolution is the ability to change within a species. And again, he proved microevolution. He just actually observed it and he wrote about it, okay? But what we want to understand is the idea of macroevolution. So in his book called Origin of Species, and you got to understand, this was when he wrote this book, it really changed the mindsets of lots of people, and it justified atheism, and it justified the rejection of the Bible, justified the rejection of religion. So actually the communists actually made statues of Darwin because Darwin was the proof that there was no God. And he himself rejected the idea of Adam and Eve and early creation. And so, but you have to understand, in his book, Origin of Species, chapters 1 through 9, he goes into microevolution. Again, microevolution is variety within kinds. It's a biblical concept. But then he extrapolates that to macroevolution in chapters 10 through 17. And so to understand this a little bit better, let's look at the wolf, okay? So the wolf is related to all the dogs. Like the huskies looks probably the closest to a wolf, but then there's the hairless dog, and there's a miniature version of I forgot the name of that dog, but it's a miniature version, okay? So what is this? There's that within the DNA, there are instructions to build variety, and variety within the kind. So why would one dog be long-haired and another dog be short-haired or nearly hairless? Okay, why? Because the environment changes, and the environmental changes in which the animal is living causes the body to react to the environment. For example, I had goats, and so someone would say, well, don't you take your goats inside when it's cold outside? Like, are you leaving them outside in the cold? The goat has the ability to develop a fluffy coat that basically insulates it. And then in the summer, it sheds that coat. The same with horses. Horses can live outside in Mongolia, for example. They get another coat. They start getting a winter coat that protects them in the cold. Where does that information come from? It's built within a species. But if I kept my goats indoors and then I took them outside, then I'm going to have to put a coat on them. Like, ooh, they're cold. But naturally within them, they have the ability. So the same with animals. Animals have the ability to trigger changes within them. They used to call it what's called junk DNA because, hey, they were able to locate DNA and then know that this DNA worked with this, but this, we didn't really understand what this DNA is, so they called it junk DNA, but it was not really junk DNA. It was part of the environmental triggers, part of the whole construction of the species. So how do you get from a wolf to a little miniature Shih Tzu, I think it's called, okay? It's all within the DNA, within the coding of the DNA. So this is variety within kinds. Like I had goats, okay? My goats would like stand on their legs and they would like reach for leaves, okay? Literally they'll be like they see a leaf, they'll be literally standing on their legs. I would see pictures of artwork 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, where they have pictures of goats standing on their legs, reaching for food. All goats are related. There's different varieties within goats. There's bigger goats, there's small goats, there's miniature goats, okay? So, and the same with sheep, same with other animals, okay? So, what does the Bible say about this? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 24 to 25, and this is very important to understand because this is where a lot of people are confused with their faith, and a lot of people say that, well, I'm learning about evolution, and and I don't understand how it's not in the Bible. Well, the Bible teaches how God made things. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, 25, it says, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, okay? Livestock and creeping things, beasts of the earth according to their kinds. What that means is that there's a kind and there's varieties of that kind. Just like we have a wolf and there's varieties to the wolf going all the way to the dachshund, all the way to the hairless dog, to the husky, to the Malamute, the different dogs. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds and the livestock according to their kind and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So within each animal, there's the variety in the genetic code to produce different species according to their kind. Just like in the human world, we don't all look alike, but human beings, for the most part, have 2 limbs, 2 legs, eyes, a brain, have the ability to think, but we have different color, different pigmentation, different hair varieties, different heights, different, the different things that make us who we are. And so it's the same in the animal world. God made animals with a variety of kind. So, for example, literally they can trace all dogs to the common ancestor of the gray wolf. and this is important as we're going to see, because this is, again, whereas a lot of people are confused, but this is the idea of what's kind. And so, and one of the ways we can prove that is, like, for example, is that you can actually take a zebra and a horse and breed them. And it's called a zorse. If you go to the Creation Museum, they actually have a zorse on the grounds, okay? You could take a lion and a tiger and breed them. It's called a liger. And if you take a tiger and go the other way around, it's called a tigon, okay? A camel and a llama, a kama, and a goat and a sheep, a geep, okay? So that's because they're all related. They all have a common ancestor, but there's branching from that common ancestor. Now, you've got to understand the difference between that. That's called microevolution, variety within kinds. And that's where a lot of young people, so if you're a young person, you're going to college, and you're sitting there with your college professor, and your college professor tells you that evolution proves that the Bible's not true and that God doesn't exist, then you want to make sure you understand the difference between microevolution and macroevolution, because the extrapolation to macroevolution is where the whole evolutionary argument falls apart. It's a non-biblical argument. But I'm going to show you the evidence. Now, so let me give you the biblical model. The biblical model is when, according to God created animals according to their kind. So we have the dog kind, we have the ape kind, we have the bird kind, we have the dinosaur kind, we have the reptile kind, the lizard kind. We have all these varieties according to their kind, as opposed to one common ancestor. So God created animals according to their kinds. And from that, there's genetic code, genetic variety within that to produce various different animals that we see in the world today. So God didn't need to produce 10 different types of sheep. All he had to do was produce one with the ability to have variation within it, and that's why we have kinds. And so, and we're going to get into Noah's Ark later in this class, but so when Noah loaded these animals on the ark, and they were loaded on according to kinds, and so when they were offloaded, they started reproducing, and then the divisions broke out according to kinds, because there were environmental triggers, and there still are environmental triggers for animals that are going to cause variation in kind. And human beings, the same thing. You know, the human beings have different hairstyles, different how we look according to the things and how the environment affects us. So, but now we want to understand macroevolution. What is macroevolution? This is the idea, they called it Luca, okay? But it gets down to what's called the proto-cell. Just like you have a prototype, you're going to build something, so you make a prototype, the first one. So there's a proto-cell according to evolution. That's what Darwin is saying, okay? And the proto-cell is the first cell. And then from that cell, there are macro changes, okay? It goes large changes from a simple organism to complex. Now, here's where this argument starts to fall apart. And if you talk to anybody about this, they're going to add some words in called natural selection, okay? But here you have to really understand this, okay? So how do you get from a proto-cell to a zebra? You have to have large amounts of information introduced into the proto-cell, okay? Because a zebra and a bird have information, like the ability to fly, the ability to, how do you make feathers? How do you design light bones allowing the bird to fly? All these things are part of it, okay? So how do you get all those changes? Where does that information come from? Where is that information coming from? What's the source? And again, the evolutionist will say, the secularist will say, there's no God. So since there's no God, we'll say, well, where does that information come from? Well, they're going to have to say it's accidental. Okay, it's accidental information because there's no intelligence behind us. So, but now think about this. So, to go from a lizard to a bird, all the steps that are involved. So you have to have, and there's a lot more steps. I'm just talking a couple steps, just to show you example. The design of the wing. How is the wing that, when we wanted to create flight, where did we look to? We actually copied the engineering of a bird wing to design our own wings. We looked at that. It's not like we taught the birds taught us. So, and we have a lot of intelligence, okay? Humanity was able to design all these things, yet they couldn't come to the idea of how to design the idea of flight until they copied from the bird. So, the feather design, the bone of the wings. You know, like most people don't know it, but the bone in a bird's wing is a lot lighter than normal bones because it's for the ability to fly. The bone of the wings, and how do you get from the wings from a lizard? Okay, where does that? So you have information that has to be inputted. For example, here's the feet of a bird, which looks a lot like the feet of a lizard. So we see, oh, okay, where did that come from? Okay, now, so this is what we have to understand. Where does that information come from? How to make the feathers, the engineering for the wings, okay? These are the steps that are often like just bypassed, not even examined. And that's where we're going to talk about how you and I as believers can challenge the dogma, because it's taught as absolute fact in most high schools, most universities, most television shows. There's not even a question, and if you question it, you're ridiculed for questioning it because you're intelligent design. You want to talk about God. They call it the God in the gaps. So in other words, if you can't explain something, you're filling in the gaps with God because you can't explain it. But the atheist basically just says it's chance, and they just try to get you to accept that as fact. Now, again, I want to make sure that if you know anybody who's an atheist, who's an agnostic, who says, I don't believe in God, I want proof for God, I'm more than willing to meet with anybody, okay? So, but we have to ask ourselves, where does that information come from? Now, Thomas Huxley, he was what was called Darwin's bulldog. So his idea, when Darwin was around, they had no idea of the complexity of the cell. In fact, he explains the complexity of the cell this way. He called it protoplasm, okay? He would say the protoplasm, simple or nucleated, is the formal basis of all life. It is the clay of the potter, which bake it and paint it as he will, remains clay, separated by artifice and not by nature from the commonest brick or the sun-dried clod. Thomas Huxley had no idea how complex life is. And that's what we need to understand, because most people are deceived when they think that life is simple. Life is incredibly complex, but it's absolute evidence for the existence of God. There's no way around getting to the existence of God, because there's no way life can come into existence without God. I'm going to show you that evidence shortly, okay? So let's look at the proto-cell. So the proto-cell, and just going to examine three problems with the proto-cell. The complexity of the cell. The three problems is matching DNA and cell hardware, the ability to replicate itself, and complex proteins. So this is basically a picture of just a cell, okay? Now we might think, you see that in school biology, it's just, okay, we just accept it's a cell. The first one just happened to come into existence, then it needed to know how to replicate. So let's look at some of the major problems with the whole evolutionary argument. The first one in this proto-cell is the idea of hardware and the DNA. Now think about it. This is where a lot of people completely, they don't examine the evidence. So the first argument is, okay, the cell just came into being. Okay, the first cell just came into being. So what's that first cell? What's inside of that first cell? Well, there's all kinds of what's called organelles, which are basically just like you and I have a heart, you have a lung, you have a pancreas, you have all these different organs that help your cell, that help your body to function. In every cell, there's organs in that cell that allow it to function. And what are these organs made out of? They're made out of proteins. But not only that, you have to understand, how do you get these organs, okay? They're assembled. They're complex They're complex units, and they're made of proteins. Your body is made of proteins, like your hair is made of keratin. So the organs of the cell, there has to be instructions on how you make a mitochondria, which is basically like an engine inside of your cell that's producing your cell and energy for your cell. How do you make the mitochondria? So the very first cell came, even if you said, someone says, well, okay, it all just happened, the very first cell. But here's the problem with that. You need the DNA. Now, why do you need the DNA? Because the DNA is the code, it's the information on how do you make the mitochondria, okay? How do you make the chloroplast? It's the information. So if you don't have the information to make it, you can't make another one. So not only do you have to have the product, which is, let's say, for example, we're going to talk about the ribosome in a second, but let's just say the ribosome or the mitochondrion. So you have the mitochondrion. So now I need the instructions on how do I make this mitochondrion? Where are these instructions going to be? They're in the DNA. So now you got a mitochondria, but you don't have the DNA. So someone has to take the information on how to make that mitochondria and put it in the DNA. It's like the chicken and the egg. So you need the information to have the mitochondria, but you need the mitochondria, so they're not, how are they both happening at the same time? It's impossible. Because when you look at that argument that I just showed you, that was a TED Talk, and they said, okay, the first cells just happened. Okay, how does the first cell happen? Who's encoding the information of that very first cell into DNA to make the very next cell? Now, I'm just going to show you a cell without instructions would die. If you don't have instructions on how to make the next cell, it's going to die. It's like if you have a car, but you're going to have to, that car is going to have to produce another car. Someone needs to encode the instructions on how to build the engine of that car into the factory so it can build the next car. So you have the car, you have the engine, but now what are the instructions for that car? That's what the DNA is. The DNA is the encoded instructions, okay? So, again, the atheist will say it just happened. It just, accept the fact that it just happened. There's no way possible. So I'm going to show you the mathematics behind this, okay? So an organelle, okay? So organelles are made of proteins. What are proteins? Proteins are assembled 20 amino acids. There's 20 amino acids that make up every part of your body, okay? 20 amino acids, the proteins in your body. They're assembled. Just like you're writing like you would write a word, okay? So the average protein is a chain of 400 amino acids. It's basically, think of a 400-letter word, okay? But let's just simplify it. Let's take a 10-chain amino acids, not 400. We're just going to take it all, one protein. We're just talking about one protein. We're not even talking about something alive. We're talking about one protein, which you would need literally hundreds, if not thousands, of proteins to make up something alive. But let's just start out with one protein, okay? And we're not even going to do a 400-chain amino acid protein. We're going to do a 10-chain amino acid protein. What are the odds of the right amino acids coming together to form one 10-chain amino acid protein, okay? And this is from Google AI. So I'm letting you see, this is what Google AI is saying. This is the probability of a 10-chain amino acid forming in a specific order is incredibly small. Roughly 1 to the 20th to the 10th power. About 1 in 10.24 trillion, okay? That's if you have all the components and you just keep spinning the dice, okay? That's the odds of you getting one 10-chain amino acid protein. One. Not let me talking about life. I'm just talking about one protein, okay, that has to make up your first life, okay? This is because there are 20 different amino acids. Each position in the chain has 20 possibilities. Even for short chains, the number of possible combinations is vast, and the odds of a specific functional sequence forming by chance are astronomically low. So, in other words, it's impossible. It's impossible for one 10-chain amino acid protein, let alone a 400-chain, let alone life. Without an intelligent cause, it's impossible. So kids who are buying into the idea that life just happened, have been sold a false bill of goods. And again, it's our job as believers to help people see the evidence. Again, that's why I love talking to atheists. I love talking to agnostics because the evidence is so overwhelming. So if you kind of think about it, it's kind of like you can have a mannequin. A mannequin might look like it's alive, okay, but it doesn't have the organs inside of it to operate. So think of the DNA. The DNA is like the seed of the apple. So you got an apple, you got your first apple, but the DNA is telling that apple how to make bark, how to make a tree, how to make leaves, how to create cells. All the instructions are in the seed of that apple, okay? So an apple without a seed would only last one generation. It's very similar to the software. Is like DNA is like software code, and the organelles and the proteins are the hardware, and they're required. So, and then that's the first problem of the very first cell. Think about the very first cell comes into existence, like a baby. How could the very first cell know it needed to replicate itself? I mean, if you listen to that video, it's like talking like that very first cell has intelligence. It's assembling all information. It's replicating itself. It knows it needs to replicate itself. Does a baby know it needs to replicate itself? No. Does a baby know it's going to be future generations and it's going to be one day it's going to be a grandfather? No, okay? Was that first cell self-aware? So imagine a baby knowing about its future needs for self-replication. So replication is incredibly complex. I mean, that's just, I'm not even going into great detail, but the ability to replicate is to copy the DNA. That's why the DNA is important, because you're able to take the DNA and make a copy of it so it's ready for the next generation, okay? So that's where the argument falls apart. Let me just show you what's taking place. That is how you get hair. That's how you get every part of your body. So the complex proteins, okay, proteins are made of the 20 amino acids. They require exact matching. Then they require folding. We'll talk more about that in a second, okay? So for example, a simple bacteria has 4,000 unique proteins. 4,000 unique proteins in a simple bacteria, okay? And that means that each protein has a corresponding gene. That's important to remember. The gene is the instructions on how to make that protein. So a simple bacteria that you flush down the toilet, that you wipe with has over 4,000 unique proteins, and that requires each of those proteins to be encoded in the DNA of that bacteria. So for example, the bacterial flagellum, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is the engine at the back of the protein, the engine at the back of the bacteria, which allows it to move, has 40 unique proteins. That's the engine. Just like you have a car engine, bacteria have engines. Flagellum is a type of engine at the back of the bacteria that propels it through the liquid medium. That requires 40 parts, okay? So why is this important? Because this demonstrates the whole idea that the very first cell formed by itself is a complete myth. There's absolutely zero possibility of it happening. It's all taught. It's like the king who has no clothes. People who will challenge it. People will mock. I'm willing to challenge it. I would love the opportunity of talking to anybody who's an atheist who says that God doesn't exist. Like, well, can you explain this? You can't. There's no way. That's why if you ever listen to any atheists, they automatically jump from, well, we don't know how it happened, but we know there's no God. It just happened. I go, it's more complex than anything we could produce, yet you would never ever say that things we make are just accidents. So that's the importance of understanding the proto-cell argument. Let me see if anybody has any questions before we move on to the next argument.